and thank you for joining me for the second monthly Cyber Awareness Update. For those of you that may not have attended last month's live webinar, this is an opportunity to learn about some of the vulnerabilities and focus areas that have come up over the last month. If you did miss that webinar, it's available on the CDSE website under Webinars. In this and future sessions, we'll go over some of the top issues and discuss their impacts and mitigation strategies. Every month there will be a recorded webinar like this one, and every quarter there will be a live session where you can ask questions and go a little bit into greater depth. But please remember that this list is not all-inclusive, and you're highly encouraged to look at the vulnerabilities that may impact your organization specifically. We'll be covering 5 major domains. Specifically, we'll talk about malware, hardware and software issues, human-related vulnerabilities, and network considerations. Before we continue, let's recall the common set of definitions that we came up with last time. Malware, short for malicious software, is software that is intended to damage or disable information systems, or to steal information or have other undesirable consequences. Often when we talk about malware, we're talking about viruses or spyware, but there are other examples as well. Hardware issues can be a little bit more difficult to define, but here we're talking about issues affecting hardware platforms over which the user has little or no control, either through configurations or settings. For example, where a firmware or version upgrade is required. Software issues are those over which the user may have a little bit more control, such as by disabling certain features or setting certain configurations, although a patch or an upgrade may still be required to close a vulnerability. Vulnerabilities related to individuals or groups are those that are primarily driven by direct human interaction, such as social engineering attacks or the stated intent of organized groups. And network vulnerabilities are those that primarily affect network components or infrastructure. Any technologies or products mentioned in this webinar are only to discuss the relevant vulnerabilities and do not constitute endorsement by the CDSE or by the federal government. Malware is short for malicious software, and it's a big concern for any organization. It's also important to remember that your antivirus solution alone might not be enough to protect your organization from malware attacks. Sometimes new viruses are developed faster than the antivirus programs can protect against them. So it's important that you and your users understand safe computing habits. This means not only keeping your system and malware protection software updated, but also taking such precautions as not clicking on untrusted links or opening attachments when you don't know the source. We can all probably remember just how much manpower was spent dealing with the configure worm a few years back. A careless click or a misconfigured system can open up a door into your organization, and that door can be very difficult to close. Last week, the FBI announced that it concluded Operation Shrouded Horizon, which they believe to be the largest coordinated law enforcement effort against an online criminal forum ever. In this case, the dark code forums had hundreds of users that were buying, selling, and trading malware, botnets, credit card information, and more. The site boasted several hundred users and was not only password protected, but each member had to be vetted before they could be granted access. When it was infiltrated and brought down, several malware variants were shown to be more popular than others. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're new or emerging, but it does give an indication of the current interests and vulnerabilities being exploited by hackers. Among them was Dendroid, a remote access tool that specifically targets Android phones and can activate your camera and microphone without your knowledge. And it can also transmit the audio and video to a remote server for use later. Facebook Spreader, which targets users through their Facebook accounts, and several spam botnets designed to target cell phone users. Botnets that were created specifically to target banking information or credit card information, and more. That's why it's so important to keep your antivirus updated and make sure that your users understand what safe computing means. Next, hardware-related vulnerabilities, where the vulnerability normally affects the actual firmware or non-user accessible settings. Sometimes hardware vulnerabilities can also fall into the category of software, so it's important to look at things from multiple different perspectives. Sometimes when you go into a hotel or an airport, you'll see that you have access to their Wi-Fi hotspot. That's normally controlled by some sort of gateway, such as those made by Ant Labs. Certain versions of Ant Labs gateway products are vulnerable to arbitrary code injection, which may allow an attacker to gain administrative credentials or compromise the gateway. If you have one of the affected versions, a firmware update is available through the vendor by using either the gateway's internal update or by manually copying it to the device. A vulnerability specific to the Samsung Galaxy S5 series of phones could allow an attacker to execute arbitrary files on the phone. According to Samsung, most recent over-the-air updates patch this vulnerability, but they also warn that not all devices have received the software. It's important to check your phone to make sure that you're running the most recent software version in order to be protected. Software is where we tend to see most of the cybersecurity concerns, although that's certainly not true in all cases. But using software is where your users generally spend most of their time on an information system. Between misconfigured and unpatched software and opportunities for misuse, software vulnerabilities are definitely a concern. Oracle just released its quarterly security fix collection, patching 193 vulnerabilities across 63 products using MySQL and Solaris. This highlights the importance of configuration management on the network, because it becomes a lot easier to react to mass updates like this if you know what's actually on your network. Some of the fixes are critical, so it's important to review the patches and install them as needed. Similarly, Microsoft released its latest round of patches for its products. They released 14 roll-ups affecting 84 software implementations, including all of the currently supported operating system versions and Office applications. Depending on the system's configuration, the patches may or may not have been automatically installed, but you can review the released patches and see what might apply to you. This Firefox vulnerability is the same as was discussed in last month's webinar, but the version numbers have changed. That's important to note because it tells us that the vulnerability in the latest version was discovered and exploited very quickly. The impacts were the same. It could allow a denial of service attack, let the user execute arbitrary code, or obtain sensitive information from memory if not updated. An update is available through the vendor which addresses this specific vulnerability. Internet Explorer has also announced an update that closes vulnerabilities in versions 6 through 11. The majority of the announced vulnerabilities affect version 11, so current versions of the software should be patched, while older versions should be upgraded if at all possible. Out-of-date software still represents a significant risk to DoD networks because the older versions are often unsupported or have unmitigated vulnerabilities. And finally, new vulnerabilities have been discovered for Adobe Flash Player and Air, affecting multiple versions shown here. Those vulnerabilities can allow a remote attacker to bypass security protections and write to the file system, which can then lead to further exploitation. Flash remains a common target for attackers because it's very commonly used and it's often left unpatched. In this case, updating the software to the most recent version will close those vulnerabilities. Now let's move on to the human side. There's always a human in the equation somewhere, either creating the attack or being fooled into doing something the attacker wants them to do. You can train and educate your users to help protect against the latter, but the former, the attacker that wants your information or assets, will always be a factor. Many of you are concerned about the recent OPM cybersecurity incident, with the first of 2 incidents announced in April and the most recent being discovered just last month. The loss of personally identifiable information has obvious cybersecurity considerations, and I strongly encourage you to keep up to date with their efforts to contact those that are affected and to secure the government systems using the link shown on your screen. Let's briefly look at each because it's a very relevant case study. With the first breach in April, the records of 4.2 million current and former employees were inadvertently disclosed. Notifications have been sent out for that incident. However, while OPM was investigating the root cause and impact of that incident, they discovered an additional compromise that affected 21.5 million individuals, including current and former federal employees, contractors, job applicants, and their spouses, cohabitants, and family members of the same. Notifications for that incident have not yet begun, but OPM will be sending out notifications as necessary to those affected. It's important to note there's currently no record of a misuse of data. But all the same, if you think you've been affected, you should monitor your bank and your credit cards, be vigilant of phishing attempts, and think cybersecurity. Keep your system patched, keep your antivirus up to date, and as always, watch out for strange attachments or social media friend requests. Again, you can keep up to date of the incident as it unfolds on OPM's website. And finally, we'll discuss network-related vulnerabilities. I remember one time at a previous job, I was part of a team that's working to remediate a widespread network outage. It turned out that the default configuration had been propagated to all of the routers on the network, essentially leaving them unable to communicate with one another. In this case, it was a simple misconfiguration that's pretty easy to fix. However, the impact of being down for that length of time was pretty significant. I realized how much worse it could have been if the outage was the result of a targeted, malicious attack that exploited one of the vulnerabilities that may have applied to our network infrastructure. Many of your networks might use SolarWinds to monitor or manage the network components. If so, be aware that certain versions of Storage Manager are vulnerable. Even without authenticating to the device, attackers may be able to upload and execute scripts, resulting in denial of service and a loss of network visibility. If you have an impacted software version, the hotfix from the vendor will help to secure it. Cisco is the manufacturer of multiple network components, such as those listed here. Multiple serious security vulnerabilities have recently been announced, which could allow an attacker to access the system, conduct remote attacks, upload files, execute scripts, commit a denial of service attack, and more. Many networks out there do use Cisco products, so as always, it's important that you know what's on your network and how it's configured. Again, that's why it's so important to know what's on your network, so that you can respond to these incidents a little more quickly. That way you know what needs to be updated, and you can better plan for any mission impacts due to the process. And finally, Juniper Networks announced multiple vulnerabilities in their SRX series of gateways and their Juniper operating system. The potential impacts include remote attacks, session hijacking, undesirable file uploads, script injections, denial of service, and other attacks. Updating the affected software will remediate those vulnerabilities. Of course, you're wondering, what do you need to do? What's your role in protecting the DoD information and assets? As a security professional, you have a very important role in protecting your networks. And one of the best ways to accomplish this is by forming a partnership with your IT and your cybersecurity teams. By initiating that dialogue, you'll have a better understanding of the issues that may be a concern, and they'll be able to better convey what resources they need in order to effectively protect the network. They're also the ones that should have a solid understanding of what's on the network, both hardware and software, assuming that your organization maintains a hardware and a software baseline and a configuration management program. That way you know what vulnerabilities may apply to you, and you can react much more quickly to announcements. And you can keep up to date on those vulnerabilities through the U.S. Computer Emergency Response Team, or U.S. CERT, which is linked to in the sidebar here. And finally, use the CDSE resources to keep up to date on emerging vulnerabilities and on cybersecurity concepts. The goal of this presentation is not to get too far into the weeds, but if you have any questions about where to look for vulnerabilities or about this presentation, please feel free to email the cybersecurity team at cybersecurity.training@dss.mil. I want to thank you for joining us on this webinar, and I hope that you found some of the information that will help keep your network secure. Keep an eye out for 6 new RMF courses coming up later this month, and watch for additional OBMS job aids and resources coming up in August. And remember, we'll be releasing a new cybersecurity awareness update webinar every month, with a live session occurring once a quarter. Please take advantage of what CDSE has to offer and learn more about the issues and concerns that may come up. Until then, on behalf of CDSE, this is Chris Cox. Thanks for watching.